He was one of the most brutal and ruthless kings ever to rule over a nation, but Henry VIII was incredibly harrowing and brutal. He was someone who had no care for even those closest to him, and he would execute 2 of his own wives, but there were some harrowing executions that the king personally ordered. For example, he insisted upon the death of the elderly Countess of Salisbury, Margaret Pole, whose head was hacked from her shoulders upon Henry's orders by a botching executioner who took many, many swings at her neck inside the walls of the Tower of London. Her execution was incredibly unnecessary, but the king had it carried out regardless. But one of the most shocking executions saw Henry VIII change the laws of his nation to allow a man to be boiled alive in a large pot in front of a crowd of thousands. But less is known about a woman who was subjected to the same treatment by the terrifying Tudor king 10 years after the most famous case of boiling alive occurred inside of his realm. But how did Henry VIII boil a woman alive? For much of history, women were spared some of the most harrowing execution methods. For example, the method of hanging, drawing and quartering was only performed upon men, and women were also subjected to hanging. There were only a few occasions in which women, such as former queens, were subjected to a beheading also, but they could of course be burned alive at the stake. But with the execution method and punishment of method of boiling alive, Henry VIII brought this in for a number of reasons in the year 1532. One of the king's biggest enemies at the time was Bishop John Fisher, and Fisher was subjected to a poisoning plot that killed 2 people. The reality of this was that the cook, Richard Roos, had put a poison inside the porridge, and this had been eaten, but Fisher the target had not eaten as he was fasting. For this crime, poisoning, which Henry VIII greatly feared, he created the most harrowing punishment, and he planned to introduce the most severe consequences as a way of putting people off committing the same crime. For this, he ordered boiling alive, and this may have been symbolic. The action of lowering Roos into the pot may have been representative of the poison being put into the cauldron inside the kitchens of John Fisher. Henry also may have wanted to showcase his brutal side, and in a speech to Parliament he claimed that His Highness, considering that man's life above all things is chiefly to be favoured, and voluntary murders most highly to be detested and abhorred, and specially all kinds of murders poisoning, which in this realm hereof the Lord be thanked hath been most rate and seldom committed or practised. He changed the laws of his own country to ensure that boiling alive would be the punishment for those who committed poisoning attacks upon those who were their masters. It was claimed inside of the law that the said poisoning be adjudged high treason, and that the said Richard Roos, for the said murder and poisoning of the said 2 persons, shall stand and be attainted of high treason, and shall be therefore boiled to death without benefit of clergy, and that in future murder by poisoning shall be adjudged high treason, and the offender deprived of his clergy and boiled to death. Richard Roos had confessed to the crime through the means of torture, as it was said that he was racked inside the Tower of London. On the 15th of April 1532, Richard Roos was lowered in and out of the boiling pot in front of a huge crowd at Smithfield, and it was claimed that he roared mighty loud, and divers women who were big with child did feel sick at the sight of what they saw, and were carried away half dead. And other men and women did not seem frightened by the boiling alive, but would prefer to see the headsman at his work. But Richard Roos's boiling alive was a harrowing one, and it was only used again as an execution method 10 years later. But this time it was used upon a woman. Henry VIII allowed the execution method to be used upon a female servant who worked inside of a wealthy household. This woman, who was named Margaret Davy, was accused of the crime of poisoning by the woman who employed her. It was recorded in the documents that to kill a man by poisoning is the most detestable of all, because it is most horrible and fearful to the nature of man, and of all others can be least prevented, either by manhood or providence. This offence was so odious that by Act of Parliament it was made high treason, and it inflicted a more grievous and lingering death than the common law prescribed, viz., that the offender shall be boiled to death in hot water, upon which stature Margaret Davy, a young woman, was attainted of high treason for poisoning her mistress, and some others, was boiled to death in Smithfield, the 17th of March in the same year. This piece of legislation, which related back to the execution and sentencing of Margaret Davy, offered a very interesting number of points. First of all, Henry VIII was happy to execute a woman at the time, in which they were usually hanged, but he wanted to execute Margaret Davy in the most brutal way possible, in the same manner as Richard Roos. He also did not commute her execution method like he often would, meaning that Davy was probably from a poorer background, and this is backed up with the fact she allegedly had poisoned those who she worked for. She was accused of poisoning a woman who employed her, and for this she was sentenced to death. Margaret Davy was a maidservant, and she specifically was accused of poisoning 3 people in the house where she lived. In exactly the same place that the first boiling alive would take place, the final boiling alive would occur inside of England. It took place at Smithfield, in the same place where many people were burned alive throughout the centuries. Margaret Davy was brought out in front of a large crowd and was lowered in and out of the boiling pot a number of times in the same manner as Richard Roos. There was only 2 recorded boiling alives during Henry VIII's reign, and possibly in England, as the laws were later repealed during the minority of Henry VIII's son, Edward VI. The execution of Margaret Davy and her boiling alive was brutal and barbaric, and it was incredibly rare. She was condemned for allegedly poisoning 3 people, and Henry VIII had a huge fear of this sort of death, as he was concerned he would go the way of many leaders and emperors through poisoning by those close to him. But Margaret Davy was subjected to a harrowing death, and her boiling alive was the final one that took place inside of London, but other methods such as hanging, drawing and quartering were still being deployed. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel please make sure to subscribe, and again thank you so much for watching.